Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and this presentation is going to examine 4 key factors to American society in the 1920s, as well as putting them in context and explaining just what the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age was. So let's begin with that context. The Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age are descriptions of America in the 1920s that create images of a society with money to spend, a society enjoying life to the full. It is the America that gave birth to the modern age, the world of consumer gadgets that made household chores so much easier. It was the age of the skyscraper and the car. It was the age of mass entertainment. But at the same time, it was also an age in which people struggled. It was the age of prohibition, rising crime and gangsters. And it was also a time when the Ku Klux Klan grew in strength and influence, taking the law into its own hands. America was both these things. Indeed, it could be called the age of contrasts. But let's develop this image of the Roaring Twenties that we have. The car liberated people. The cinema excited them. It was the time when sport became a mass spectator phenomenon. There was jazz on the radio and in the clubs, and there were dance crazes. The Hollywood star was born, or created. It was an age that pushed the existing boundaries as social attitudes changed radically. It was the age of the flapper. Even prohibition didn't dampen the spirit, forgive the pun, as it only made alcohol more exciting. And this was all fueled by 3 things. A lot of people had more disposable income, as average wages rose by 10% in real terms, whilst the average working week dropped. So people had more leisure time. And technology, it put the radio into most homes and the cinema into all towns. But it was largely an urban phenomenon. And remember, half of Americans lived in rural communities. And much of it was a middle-class phenomenon. And don't forget that 60% of Americans were living on or below the poverty line. So the numbers living the dream were not always as great as you might think. Yes, sport and the cinema, but not so much the car, and certainly not the flapper. It was one of those cases in which the image was not the reality. Not for most of Americans anyway. And of course you need to have all this covered with a few pertinent facts and examples. Let's focus on women. The first thing that must be said is that women can't be treated as a homogeneous group, a group that's all the same. There were rich women, middle-class women, working-class women, and poor women. There were white women, black women, and women from immigrant families. Women living in cities, women living in rural communities, older women and younger women. And there was every other kind of woman that goes up to make a complex society. That said, there were 2 things that led many women to see themselves differently in the 1920s, and to demand that society see them differently too. First, they entered the workplace, And second, in 1918, they got the vote, and with it, a degree of political power. What got them into the workplace and what jobs they were doing in the 1920s, and things like their pay, are the detail you need to be ready with. Also, the extent to which it changed their lives, from spending power to a change in their behaviour, the way they saw themselves, and the expectations that they had. And you also need to think about the way society responded. For example, the way in which markets opened up for women, in fashion for instance, and how advertisers targeted women, again with regards to fashion or domestic products. But keep it in perspective. 60% of Americans lived on or below the poverty line, and half of Americans lived in rural communities, when only around a third of farms had running water and few had electricity. As for African American women, they were much more likely to take in washing than to have a washing machine. And don't forget, there was a conservative reaction. So let's look at that reaction. Rural America was ill at ease with the apparent self-indulgence, materialism, and the freer sex that they saw in city life. They were concerned that Christian values seemed to be breaking down, and with them the traditional country values of clean living, hard work, and thrift. There was a conservative reaction to the flapper and to the modern woman in general. It was a generational thing. It was rural culture versus city culture. And there was a religious, moral dimension too. There was also a reaction from many men who felt threatened by this new, assertive, independent female. And conservative America was very ill at ease with the way in which sex was being made visible in magazines, in the cinema, and on the dance floor. But it is with alcohol that rural America, conservative America, made its stand. And in looking at the reasons for prohibition, you want to do two things: explain the reasons and the different degrees of significance of each factor. Some were on a personal level, that it damaged people's health and that it damaged family life. Some were economic, that it affected productivity. There was a racial dimension, with some arguing that alcohol emboldened African Americans, whilst churches were concerned about the decline in moral standards as a result of drunkenness. It also became a matter of patriotism during World War I. And as America divided between wets and dries, you need to consider the organisation of each side and how it was that the dries carried the day. The role played by women was very important, and this links to women gaining the vote. Also, the federal system was an important factor, as individual states made their move before Washington. But then there were the Prohibition years. Something to remember is that consuming alcohol was actually never made illegal. The Prohibition Act or Volstead Act only made the manufacture, sale and transportation of intoxicating liquors illegal. That said, you need to be prepared for 4 questions. What was prohibition? And of course that includes the Act itself, but also the Al Capone years, if you like. How was prohibition enforced? What was its impact? And this would include the growth of organised crime and corruption, as well, of course, as its impact on consumption, and whether it improved the moral life of America. And ultimately, why did it fail? You would want to include the costs to the economy and increased crime, things countering the arguments for prohibition in the first place, and the simple fact that so many Americans simply wanted a drink. But if a question asks, why was it repealed, you could add the Great Depression, and also include the organisation for repeal. They were caught asleep when prohibition was introduced, but not now. But before finishing with prohibition, an exam question could place an awkward emphasis on whether it was a success, or whether it was good for America. Past questions have. So how do you address this? Well, if it was good for America, you make use of the arguments for its introduction, from economic reasons to protecting family life. As to how it can be seen as a success, well, it did last 15 years, and you could emphasise the impact of the Great Depression on the decision to repeal the law. And now we turn to prejudice and intolerance, and first an overview. There was the changed attitude towards immigrants, with immigration laws that discriminated against certain nationals, and the Red Scare, the reaction to socialists, communists and anarchists that swept the country. There was also the Ku Klux Klan, an organisation that believed in white supremacy and fueled hatred against African Americans, but also Catholics, Jews and homosexuals as well. There was discrimination against Native Americans too. Whilst prohibition showed an intolerant attitude, as well as the great divide between rural and urban America. The monkey trial too showed the same divide, as rural fundamentalist Christians simply couldn't accept science, in this case Darwin's theory of evolution, contradicting what was in the Bible. And so approaches to prejudice and intolerance. In my ebook on American society, I suggest you first think about the reasons for prejudice and intolerance, and I suggest you think of four, or group them into four categories: economic, racial, religious, and political, noting which groups were targeted for each of the different reasons, and identifying specific reasons. For example, there was an intolerance shown to the new immigrants in America because of the strikes that were a threat to the American economy, because they were seen as coming from more backward regions of Europe, because many were Catholic when America was founded on the Protestant ethic, and because they were a challenge to the American way of life. And you then need to give evidence for these reasons and consider a hierarchy of significance. Then consider the ways and extent to which prejudice and intolerance showed itself. And I would do the same for the way in which rural America viewed urban America. Take the example of African Americans. From personal abuse, verbal and physical, to structural racism, lower paid jobs, poor housing, and second-rate schools and medical care, segregation and still denied the vote whenever possible, and the Ku Klux Klan allowed to operate outside of the law. And you will need to be strong on the specific case studies, such as the Sacco and Vanzetti trial and the Monkey trial. And that's the end of this presentation. I really do wish you luck with your revision. I hope my website, History Made Easier, is proving useful too. And of course, I wish you the best of luck with your exam. But for now, I do thank you for listening. Cheers.